Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much for showing up. I hope some of you had fun at IBM last night. Very difficult to follow Peter, I think. And law drawing, not so many people, but I'm actually surprised how many people are here. Just for me to get a feel for, is there any lawyer in the audience? Well, okay, so I have to be careful what I say. But okay, anyone who has a friend who is a lawyer? Okay, a good friend who is a lawyer? Okay, very good. So my background, I graduated from high school in 2000, so I was familiar with the Y2K problem, which I think is somewhat similar to the AI problem, in the sense that I think it's not going to be as bad as some people might think. I finished my legal studies here in Berlin at Humboldt University in 2008. I moved to Frankfurt. I finished my practical legal education there in 2011. I finished my PhD in capital markets law in 2012. And I finished the machine learning course of Andrew Ng in 2017. So that was me trying to make an effort to get more familiar with the machine learning community. I hope it helps me to try and make things more transparent for you in terms of how the law works, how it relates to ethics, and what that can mean for you as a machine learning and data science community. Yeah. So no lawyer presentation without a disclaimer, as I am just a lawyer, so please be gentle. Probably there will be a lot of mistakes. Maybe you don't agree with everything that I say. I hope that's okay. So, a quick overview. The simple approach when you look at these three topics that I grasp, machine learning, ethics, and law, the way I set it up is, for me, if you look at machine learning, what you guys do, it's what can you do, right? That's what you are interested in. What can I do? Ethics is about what should you do in terms of what is right and wrong. We'll come to that later. And the law is about what may you do, may there being an operator of what are you allowed to do. Yeah. And with regulation and rules, it's always good to bear in mind what you want to achieve. Yeah. So the topics that we're talking about in terms of what are we trying to achieve is, or the downside that we're trying to avoid is from your perspective, probably it's mostly useless tools, right? You care about whether your model works or doesn't work. As a lawyer, I'm not really interested in that one other than if you're not successful, you're not going to pay me, right? What gets more important when you come to data protection is, do you invade the privacy of other people? Do you discriminate against people? Do you fabricate models that allow the oppression of people? And then the ultimate, the big one, do you produce something that is going to make us extinct? Yeah? And whenever you look at what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to regulate, it's always important to know what level you are talking about. Because I think if we're talking about things that might lead to the extinction of mankind, we will be a little bit more rigorous than if we talk about maybe minor infractions on privacy. Yeah, so that's good to know. The legal framework for machine learning, there is no comprehensive legal framework. There is, however, there are a lot of relevant legal concepts. The most important one, which I'm guessing everyone is familiar with because I saw a lot of the topics there and I heard a lot of the talks, is data protection and privacy. But there's also, for example, intellectual property. Peter talked about that. So whatever you do you copy things? Do you not copy things? Is it okay to do certain things? Is it okay to develop things that can mimic stuff that other people do? That is something to be aware of. There will be an aspect of consumer protection, right? If you have a model that faces a lot of people, public policy and therefore law is very conscious of protecting what is perceived weak people, and consumers are considered weak as they face companies. So consumer protection might be relevant for whatever you do. We have communications and media regulation, which why I'm saying I'm not really a tech lawyer, because a lot of that stuff I don't really understand. Sometimes I have the feeling most of us as lawyers don't really understand that regulation. That makes it a little bit difficult for the people who are trying to operate based on that regulation, because you don't find many people who know how to do it. And ultimately something you might care about ultimately, depending on where you are in the food chain, is liability. So lawyers, we can be very creative. So even if we don't have a specific rule governing what it is that you do, telling you cannot do this or you cannot do that, once you've caused harm, we have a certain toolkit where we can find ways to still make you pay, because we also have abstract regulation about generally if you cause harm and you're culpable, you might have to pay damages. So the most important bit when you talk about data science and machine learning is GDPR. Everyone familiar with GDPR? No. Okay, it's the General Data Protection Regulation. It's an EU regulation. That means, I don't know how many people are from Europe or not. The EU is not a country. Germany is a country, but the EU is let's say, a community of European countries that is, for us lawyers, probably for you it's boring. For us it's a little bit exciting because it's a supranational body that has lawmaking powers, even though it's not a state in and by itself. So one of the tools that they have are regulations. That means it's passed at EU level. It becomes law immediately in every European state that's part of the EU. So as the EU, we have the privilege of having one framework for data protection, which allows you, when you're in the EU, to move around and be sure that the data protection level is hopefully always the same. But that's hopefully, because even though it is a regulation that directly applies everywhere, every European member state has its own national data protection law, because the EU regulation allows for some adaptations to be made. In Germany, that is the Bundesdatenschutzgesetz. And then you have the EU Commission, which as a regulatory body enforces GDPR. So when Google gets a fine, that's the EU Commission deciding whether that fine will be imposed or not. And for Germany, since we have 16 states and it's a state matter, we have 16 authorities that for each state enforce GDPR. So if you're in Berlin, that's the Berliner Datenschutzbeauftragte. If you're in Bavaria, that's the Landesdatenschutzamt. And each of these people, they may talk to each other, but they don't necessarily talk to each other. So each of these institutions has its own interpretation of what is important in terms of data protection. So it's also good to know where you are and what the guidance of your specific authority is in terms of what you do. But if you are, for example, curious, I've included a few links at the end of the presentation. The Berlin Data Protection Authority, for example, offers a consultation period for startups where you can actually talk to them about what their understanding of the GDPR is and what you should do and what a good data protection regulation is, or how you protect the data of data subjects. So the most important GDPR principles, it's one of the cornerstones of this is it's restricting the use of personal data. So the way this regulation works is you may not process personal data unless you are allowed to. So the default rule is you may not process personal data. Whenever you process personal data, you need some kind of justification. There's a catalog of justifications, but that also gives you an understanding of how the people who pass the regulation view the use of personal data. So the use of personal data is in and by itself suspicious. So you are kind of in a position where you have to justify what you're doing, actively justify what you are doing. Another principle is transparency. So a lot of the regulations in there are you need to make transparent what it is that you're doing. Why are you doing it that way? Why are you doing it this way? Why are you using AWS? Why are you using a server here? Why are you sending the data from here to there? Why did you do that model that way? So in terms of your considerations on how do I protect the data of my data subjects, that needs to be transparent. Also, your processes need to be transparent. What do you encrypt? What do you not encrypt? Why do you not encrypt it? Do you crawl data? Where do you crawl the data? What kind of data is it? So usually I would assume that all of you, since you're smart people, you have these thoughts, so you think about it. Well, at least I hope. If you don't, now is the time where you should change that approach. And one important bit that's easier for lawyers and probably for you is it's good to write it down. So when you've sat together and you've thought about how do we set up all this model, how do we ship data from here to there, and how do we protect it, it makes a lot of sense to right away take notes. And if you have a lawyer, hand them to your lawyer, and the lawyer will produce some paper that makes the regulator happy. Yeah. Security, so technically you should not have to explain people that when you handle sensitive data of data subjects, you should apply a certain level of security, whether that is you anonymize the data that is easily accessible, or whether that means you encrypt data. Yeah? So wherever you have a large data pool, the presumption will be you need to protect it or you need to anonymize the data, because if you cannot control access to that data, it becomes a risk for everyone whose data is in that pool. Another one is the autonomy of the data subject. So GDPR awards a lot of rights to the individual. So each individual whose personal data you handle theoretically may ask you what kind of data you have, how you are using it, and why you are using it, and may even ask you to stop using its personal data. So if you cannot delete personal data in your data pool, you're already violating GDPR, because you need to empower that individual to be in a position to say, no, you should stop processing my data. And that should not mean that in 10 years you will have figured out how to delete my details. It means already when you set up your process, you need to think about how do I handle these queries. And oftentimes it also means you have to actively inform the data subject that you are processing data. So that's on the website, that's the privacy notice or privacy notice, where on the website I tell you all your communication data, I will track you on Google, I will track you on Facebook. That is part of the autonomy of the data subject, where the data subject should be aware of what you're doing. No one's reading that, but in principle we lawyers are happy when something is there, at least in paper. Yeah? And it's responsibility and enforcement. So one of the major problems with data protection in the past was the rules were pretty much the same in principle as they are today, but they were not enforced. So the fines were maybe 1,000 euros or 10,000 euros. So every company just made the calculation of saying, well, if we're data protection compliant, that will cost us 500K. And if we get caught not being compliant, it will cost us 5K. So we will not be compliant. And the regulators or the lawmakers waited very long, and what happens when they wait very long and you don't do it is sometimes they overreact a little bit, and that is part of why GDPR was a little bit tougher on people than probably necessary. Since we are in Germany, I don't want to be super German dominant, but I think we have a constitutional court that has been quite intelligent about privacy issues and data protections. So they have developed a right to autonomy on your data from our fundamental rights. So in Germany, the Recht of informationelle Selbstbestimmung, i.e. the right that I decide what happens to the information about me, comes from human dignity itself, which is the most important fundamental right there is. It's untouchable. The German Constitution, its first article is human dignity is untouchable. And untouchable means it's untouchable, i.e. any law or anything violates human dignity, it's per se illegal, you cannot change it. Even the German constitution has a default rule in the back where it says, you can change the constitution, you cannot change Article 1. So human dignity is absolutely untouchable, and this Recht auf informationale Selbstbestimmung flows from human dignity. So the German Constitutional Court, in a lot of cases where they had to deal with it, for example,
Nobody's trying to censor you.
Does it work now? Okay. I haven't even come to the controversial parts yet. Okay. So how do we do that? It goes from the bottom upwards. So they separated your Recht auf informationale Selbstbestimmung into 3 parts. And they are quite logical. So they say the individual sphere is more or less you as an individual, but part of the crowd, everything that you see. So you seeing me here is the part that is not that sensitive because I'm in public. Private sphere is your private life, what you do in your home, what you do with your family, potentially your friends, but that depends on the view that constitutional judges can also only reflect the view of society. So when they pass that family was the close one, maybe you are closer with your friends than your family. You never know. But theoretically, that part is what we consider private. And the highest part is intimate. So those are your inner thoughts, your feelings, and sex. Which, well, since in Berlin, I think that also changes with society. So I think sex used to be more private in Berlin than it is now if you look at clubs like Berghain. But theoretically, for the Constitutional Court judge 10, 20 years ago, sexual life was something very, very private. Yeah? So the intimate sphere, if you go back to human dignity, the intimate sphere is more or less human dignity, i.e. that means if you handle that type of information, that is untouchable. Yeah? So when you handle data about feelings or thoughts, or when you start building models that can deduct my feelings or thoughts from publicly available data, you are moving upwards in that trajectory. And you need to be a lot more careful about what you do, at least from the perspective of lawyers or regulators. Okay, so now those were the parts that I was more comfortable with. Now we come to ethics. Also, a lot of people, I think, don't think lawyers are ethical. I will tell you, however, that under professional regulation, we are supposed to be ethical. So legally we are ethical. So when I try to figure out as a lawyer what are ethics, right? We lawyers, we like, in that sense, I think we're close to developers. We do like precision, right? We do like precise definitions. So I think that's also part of the problem that we lawyers have with ethics. When I try to look up what are ethics, I spent, I think, 5 hours, but I couldn't figure out what are ethics other than this one, which is basic notions of right and wrong, and this will conclude my talk. No, so as a lawyer, I try to do more. So what I do is I go back to law, and as lawyers, we have what we already learn at law school is be careful when you try to regulate morality. And there is a dispute in the legal community about should you separate law from ethics, or should you distinguish law from ethics? And I think distinguish is more interesting because they're not separate, but they're not the same also. So I try to draw up differences that you see when you talk about notions of right and wrong, and when you talk general notions of right and wrong, or basic notions of right and wrong, and when you talk about law, which you see in legal documents. So the application, ethics, usually right and wrong applies to everything, right? You can, whatever you want to talk about, everyone will have a view on whether that is right or wrong, at least if you ask them about it. Law, in and by itself, usually has a limited scope of application that is defined. So if you look at the German Civil Code, it will tell you, I'm governing civil law relationships between people, i.e. your contracts, your capacity to enter into contracts. Your constitution will say, well, I'm governing how Germany works as the Federal Republic of Germany, whereas ethics is just everywhere. The creator of ethics is society, right? There is no ethics committee that was set in place by the United Nations that says this is what ethics are. Everyone has an opinion of what ethics are, and somehow a consensus is built, but it's really difficult to find out what are we considering is right and what are we considering is wrong. Whereas in law, I know also the law will tell me who passed that law, who passed that regulation. I can even, but we'll get to that a little later. Also a difference is enforceability. Ethics are usually enforced, if they're not embodied in law, they're enforced by public perception, right? If Microsoft is acting, not that I'm arguing they are, but if they were acting unethical, the way to punish them for acting unethical is they will look bad. You will tell the public that they're acting unethical, and maybe that will hurt their bottom line. But again, there is no ethics court where you can say, under the ethics rule, they did violate that, so please punish them. You basically go to whatever you guys do, GitHub or Twitter, and you say Microsoft screwed up, and you hope that people will send nasty messages to Microsoft until they stop doing what they're doing. And if Microsoft is tough, they can just sit that one out or pay people, not that I'm arguing that they do that, but they could theoretically pay people to say, no, Microsoft is super awesome, stop harassing Microsoft. Yeah? Whereas in law, we are quite proud of having courts, regulatory bodies, rule of law, where we say, no, if you do this, there's a specific process, like in code, for punishing you. Yeah? And that is how that works. There's actual legal enforcement which is regulated. Transparency with ethics is really, really low. Right? So no one knows, I don't know what you think is right or wrong. I don't know what you think is right or wrong. I can look up what the law is on contracts. So that transparency is very high. Also, if Microsoft, or let's go somewhere else, if Google pulls a service because people thought it was wrong to offer that service, I don't know who the people were who decided that that was wrong. I know it's society, but everyone is in the shadows in terms of saying this is wrong, you should not do this. If I find someone as a regulator, that person knows I was the guy who fined them. If I sue Google, Google knows who I am, I sued them. Yeah? If I pass a law, at least in most somehow functioning democracies, I can look up who passed that law, who were the people who voted in favor of the law, what party were they from. Yeah? So I can figure that out. There's a lot of transparency in there. And the accountability accordingly is higher, right? If we made Google stop a service and we were wrong, there's no one who's going to be accountable for it because we don't know who it was, right? As society as a whole, we can say, well, we made a mistake, but there's no real accountability. Whereas in law, again, I know who these people are. If you look at debates in the United States, for example, when you run for president as a senator, your opponent will pull up your record of how you voted and will tell you, you voted against funding healthcare. You voted against, I don't know, supporting refugees, or you voted against paying veterans. I know what you did. You are accountable for what you do. So now, when you're trying to figure out what do ethics mean in machine learning or in data science, one of the things that I found, and I thought that I have to quote that since I'm a lawyer, and there are laws actually. So now I was happy I found laws there. So these 3 laws, which I understand make no sense, but that's where you see what you would try to do, right? So you try to come up with more specific term of what is right and wrong. So if I have a robot or if I have a system, it doesn't have to be a robot in terms of physically doing something, but if I have a model that does something that impacts people, I can come up with a notion of saying, well, it should not injure a human being, and then it becomes interesting whether it's inaction or action. And then if you go to the second law, it should always obey humans, not itself, unless that violates the first law, and it must protect its own existence as long as that does not violate the first 2 laws. And if you know the book or the movie with Will Smith, then it's very easy to create dilemmas in the system, which is something that is inherent with trying to regulate how people act with each other, right? So if I say, if there are 2 human beings fighting, now the robot has a problem, right? Because if one person punches the other one and I'm not intervening, through an action, someone gets harmed. But if I intervene and harm the person who's hitting the other person, I'm harming a human being. So what do? You tell me, probably the robot explodes because it cannot compute that. So it's bad code, probably, you would say. Yeah? So, but it's difficult to regulate that. Yeah? And I think it's also good when you think about ethics to understand some of the dilemmas that you face otherwise. So we'll do some polling. Yeah. So who thinks that the court of public opinion should be bound by the notion of innocent until proven guilty? Does everyone know what innocent until proven guilty means? Yeah, you watch TV. Okay, so who thinks that the court of public opinion, i.e. we as a society, when we condemn people, should be subject to the notion of innocent until proven guilty? By show of hands. Okay, everyone. Okay, so are you familiar with the story of Peter Kachelmann? He was our most famous weather guy. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Peter. Yeah. So he was accused of, let's call it sexual misconduct. And it turned out later on, at least for us lawyers, our life is very simple. He was not convicted, so he was innocent. But it more or less ruined his career. So even before that person was convicted, it was punished. And even though the process that we as a society have put in place to determine whether he should be punished or whether or not he was guilty came back and said he was not guilty, he was subject, in essence, to very severe punishment, because I think even if he had been convicted, there would not have been a fine as large as what he's probably foregone in income by becoming a persona non grata in society. And in that case, even though you would say, well, we should not have convicted him before the court came back with a verdict, he was more or less convicted. And that's my point about accountability. No one came back and said, well, we're really sorry, let's make you a famous person again and hug you so you feel liked. Yeah? So he is still a very disliked person, even though he was not guilty. Part of that is because some of the details of the way he treats women came out, and even though legally that was not considered illegal, society, I think, came to the conclusion that they were wrong. But if you are that human being, it's quite frightening to think that even though you have not committed a crime or something illegal, people can put your life on display for all of society to judge you while sitting in the shadows. Okay, so then something that has been mentioned here before, who thinks that you should operate a bail prediction system, i.e. a system that predicts whether or not people should be let go on bail by posting money until their court hearing. Who thinks you should operate a system that discriminates against minorities? Okay, very good. You all passed the test. What if the system is more accurate than judges or review boards on overall accuracy? No one? Oh, look at him. That's a racist right there. No, but you see now, you start thinking in terms of what is right and wrong. If I'm denying a lot of innocent people potentially bail, that's also not a nice thing to do. And now I'm trying to figure out, can I trade overall people against minorities? So now, what if the system is more accurate than judges or review boards on both overall accuracy and accuracy for minorities? Who thinks you should operate a bail system now? An automated system. Everyone else thinks that judges should send minorities to jail even though they should go out? Okay, that's quite interesting because in the legal community, there is a tendency to say, no, this is something that humans should do because it affects human lives. Whereas I would have expected here that people say, well, if the accuracy is better for minorities, then why not have it operated by a model? Okay. Okay, so those are some of the things that when you deal with that, the example was something that they operated in the United States where the system turned out to be more rigorous on, for example, African Americans than it was on Caucasians. And the odd thing about that story is that the system was put in place with the intention to be less racially biased than white judges, for example. So the idea, I think, had some merit to it to say, well, if there are a lot of Caucasian judges judging African Americans, maybe it's easier if we have a system that has no racial background to judge everyone. Sounds fair on the face of it. I think they made technical mistakes, which is where you are better placed to analyze what they did than we as lawyers are. Yeah? So what did the EU do? And what we always do is we appoint expert groups. So there's now an expert group on artificial intelligence, and it's an independent body set up by the European Commission to give you some insights into lawmaking. When a subject is very, very difficult, what lawmakers usually do is they step aside and they say, we'll have some experts tell us what we should do. That way people will not blame us when they come back and say we should do something. And we can also, if we don't like it, we can always say, well, we're not going to do it, or we're just going to bury the report. It has 52 members. It's tasked with 2 deliverables. It was supposed to draft AI ethics guidelines and a public investment, policy and investment recommendation in terms of putting Europe on the map on artificial intelligence. Both were published already, and they came up with the idea that trustworthy AI is the solution to all of the problems around artificial intelligence. So an AI we can trust per se is an AI that doesn't cause any problems. And they came up with 3 criteria, which are very groundbreaking. So it should be lawful. So your system should comply with legal regulation. It should be ethical, and it should be robust. So it should work. So that's, if you look at the amount of time and money you spend, that's a little bit of a disappointing outcome potentially. And they also carved out the legal part, and they dealt with ethics mostly and some of the robustness. So when we look at what they came up in terms of ethical principles, they came to the conclusion that they are rooted in fundamental rights. So we Germans sit there and say, yes, our constitutional court figured that one out also some time ago. The 4 cornerstones that they came up with were respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness, and explicability. So if you remember what I talked about when I talked about GDPR, some of the notions are already in GDPR. And the frustrating part here is that they don't help you understand to what extent does GDPR already achieve these ethical goals and to what extent do we need to do anything. So where do we go from here? There will be some regulation that's coming, there will be something that's doing, and it's probably going to interfere with your work. And to make sure that this really works, that this works out in the end, I think there are 3 main building blocks, and it's a funny coincidence that there was an open source presentation before that, because I think open source is one of the most important bits in terms of practice, because if everything that you do is open source, and I don't just mean software, I also mean the way you talk about what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. If all of that is open source per se, it makes it easier to argue to regulators that there's no reason to come up with some guideline from some experts telling everyone how to act, but rather that the community is finding solutions to these problems, because I think you are best placed to solve these problems because you understand what you're doing. Me as a lawyer, I don't understand how your systems work, so it's really difficult for me to come up with rules on how you should do that. I'm a huge fan of smart regulation. So economically, of course, stupid regulation is more lucrative for me because it's more difficult for you, so it means you have to hire a lawyer. But smart regulation is actually more fun because you can help people easier. And smart regulation to me means it grows organically. Ideally, law grows organically, right? So the process is society comes together, agrees on certain rules, and if there's enough consensus, that grows into a law. So if you have things where you as a community can agree those are best practices, the natural way to develop regulation is look at your best practices and try to just tie them down into legally specific language, but not changing what it is that you're doing, rather understanding what you as a community say makes sense and putting that into law. And I think that leads to something that is maybe not happening enough. It's disciplines talking to each other. It's data scientists, machine learning experts talking to lawyers, talking to ethical experts. And part of that is me making an effort of being here and trying to find out how all of these things work and trying to bring that back to the legal community. And if you find it in your heart to talk to your lawyer friends or to talk to people like me about what you think should be done, then I think that will help a lot, because ultimately what I think you need to do is take ownership of that process. Yeah? And for me, it was interesting to see that you're really already doing that, because when I researched it, you get the impression you're not doing anything. You're just, building some Terminator thing that's going to kill us all or publish all of our search history. But it was interesting for me to see how much effort you put and how much thought you put into these topics. And that awareness is talking to people about what you're doing, letting them know. Auditing, there's an initiative which I found very interesting, trying to figure out how do I trace whether my model is racist or not, or whether it discriminates or not. I listened to a very interesting presentation about encryption. There's also people looking at rule books. And if you yourselves can come up with rule books, I think that's a good thing, because what I will warn you about is you should prevent lawmaker or establishment ADHD, i.e. if we don't understand what you're doing, we will still regulate you as a legal community. So we have no problem regulating stuff that we don't understand. We've done that in the past. So if you want to help us help you, it makes sense to tell us what kind of regulation would be good for you. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Hey, thanks for your talk. I'm just wondering, one thing I didn't really hear too much about is the topic of accountability in terms of should the algorithm or machine or the person that created be responsible, or more rather, is there any law making in progress that is tackling this?
That's actually a very controversial topic in the legal community. We have various concepts of responsibility, and all of those are being discussed for autonomous systems. So, for example, in contract, we have the concept of an agent, i.e. if you are my counterparty in a contract and you use an agent to perform your duties, you remain liable to me, although you can restrict your liability for that person to a certain extent. In tort, where we don't have a contractual relationship, you're only responsible if that person is socially dependent on you. So if someone damages your house because they have their house being rebuilt or so, if they use an independent contractor, they might not necessarily be liable for that. So that would be a concept of accountability, where you use a different autonomous system, but you're not accountable. Rather, your accountability is limited to carefully selecting the person. And another concept which is quite interesting is children. So we also have a concept for parents being accountable for children. And in the legal community, there is a large discussion ongoing about, well, what is an autonomous system? Is it closer to an agent? Is it closer to an independent contractor? Is it closer to a minor that is not yet grown up? There's also product liability. So if you develop a product, you're technically responsible for what that product does to people. Even if you did not, right? If a car manufacturer manufactures a car, but you did not buy the car from the manufacturer, or you were the person who was run over by the car because the brakes didn't work, you can still sue the car manufacturer under product liability because they put the product into the market. So what's most likely to happen is that AI would fall into one of these concepts where generally it's, did you follow best practice in developing that model? So if you send out a model that doesn't follow best practice, there is a likelihood that you might be responsible.
Over here. It's not a question related to tech, but you asked us if we believe in this innocent until proven guilty concept. And I'd like to ask you what your view is on that, because I think that when a person has been accused of something by 25 women for sexual misconduct, for example, then for a judge it should be valid. He should be innocent until proven guilty. But shouldn't that be enough of proof for the society to judge someone?
Mm-hmm. I think something that is very interesting and how that is being handled is the National Football League in the United States, where they repeatedly have incidents of domestic violence, and they were trying to regulate morality and came up with a lot of... To answer your question maybe directly from the beginning, I think that notion should always apply. I think that to me is maybe similar to a model accuracy problem, right? Where I say, I'd rather take the problem of not being able to condemn someone, even though in public I'm pretty sure he did it, because I don't like it the other way around, where I think it's too much of a burden on everyone if you can be convicted without being convicted. And then if you look at the NFL, they try to come up with concepts where they put people on administrative leave. So for example, if it's a professor at a university, I think if there's enough merit, then maybe that person should not be should not be teaching per se, but maybe you should still receive his salary, right? Or if you have a priest with little boys and that accusation has merit, maybe you don't want to leave him alone with little boys anymore. But we do already have concepts for that in law, right? So you can petition a court even before they pass the ultimate judgment to take interim measures. So for example, restraining orders would be an example, right? That's before that person would be convicted. There might be an order saying you cannot get close to these women anymore. And I think that to me is the way it should be done.
Thank you so much for this great presentation. It's time to move to the next one. So, you have a question? You have a question? Maybe, okay, because we are under time.